So welcome to the Black Forks Commissary up here in the Uinta Mountains. Many Utahns have no idea that in the late 19th and early 20th century, Utah figured prominently in the railroad crosstie industry. Most people are like, what the heck's a railroad crosstie? Well, if you've ever seen a railroad, those steel rail are on top of wooden squared logs. And for 1868 until the 1930s, most of those railroad ties cut here in the Uintas were all done by hand. In the 19th century, most of the folks up here working in the Uintas were just local farmers and ranchers, non-professional tie cutters. But starting in 1913, the Standard Timber Company, organized out of Omaha, Nebraska, had an exclusive contract to supply over 9 million railroad ties to the Union Pacific Railroad throughout Wyoming, Utah, and even Idaho. So places like Black Forks Commissary, which was built around 1916, served as a major transportation and supply hub for the hundreds of tie cutters throughout the mountains. After 1913, though, we see a real change in the demographics of the Uintas. Most of the tie cutters in the 19th were just local folk, but after 1913, those railroad cutters were actually coming from Sweden and Finland predominantly. And that changes the dynamic out here, is that we see these immigration of professional tie cutters, professional loggers, and we can see it in the quality of the log cabins they built throughout the Uintas. The Standard Timber Company started really where the Mirror Lake Highway is on the west, and every 3 to 4 years kept moving operations further east until going all the way over to Henry's Fork, which dumps into the Green River on the far eastern end of the Uintas. That company operated all the way into the 1930s when we start seeing the arrival of portable sawmills, and the heyday of the tie cutter, living out here in the deep snow, kind of ended. One of the most surprising things to me when I started researching the railroad tie cutters of the Uinta Mountains is that most of the logging actually occurred in the winter. And we know that from historical records because they used the snow to help move the railroad ties around, but we can also see it on the physical landscape. So this tree was cut with probably snow up to my midsection. And so this was cut during the winter. That's why it's such a what we call a high cut stump, because this was chest high snow at the time. So to cut a railroad tie, tie cutters focused on a 8 to 10 inch diameter lodgepole pine, about this exact diameter. They would cut it at the base height, sort of chest height to them. Once it fell onto the snow, they would use just a single broad axe, standing on top of the log, cut it on both sides of them, kind of on both sides. They'd square off those two, roll the log, then do the other two sides, making it nice 7-inch square, and then they took that tree and cut it in half. So for about every tree, a tie cutter would get 2 7-foot long by 7-inch square railroad cross ties. The most prolific tie cutter was recorded at cutting 22 ties in a day. So that's 11 trees, from cutting it down to shaping them into a formal tie. After they completed their cutting, they would stack all the ties up. They called it parking. And they would stack all the ties up along a wagon road that then they would bring a horse-drawn sled along, load it on, and take it to the next part of the process. At the peak of the spring runoff, the tie cutters would open up huge splash gates in the dams and allowing millions of gallons of water to flow downstream, hauling all those ties. Then for the next week, even 2 weeks, tie drivers, which at the Black Forks Commissary, we knew there were some tie drivers from Turkey and Bulgaria, would follow those railroad ties all the way down to the Green River, where the Standard Timber Company had large booms where they would fish all the railroad ties up before being sent to large kilns to dry out. But this process of moving railroad ties along rivers happened from the 1860s all the way into the 1930s. This was a heavily intensive task. They would follow the tie drives with big sticks to unloosen them, and sometimes the ties would get so jammed they would actually have to use dynamite to sometimes break the jams free. But these rivers were critically important to the success of the railroad tie cutting industry and has reshaped the entire landscape. Scientists have actually studied that the dams built by the tie hacks in the early 20th century changed some of the ecological nature of some of these wetlands. So one of my favorite features of a Black Forks Commissary is this 2-cabin complex. In architecture, we call this a dog trot house, which is really a rare architectural style here in Utah. It's called a dog trot because you had two separate log cabins connected by a single breezeway. This was a very common architectural style in the Deep South because it allowed movement of air in between your living spaces. So this is an unusual, the only cabin of its style up here in the Uintas of the hundreds of known tie hat cabins. As we enter the actual cabin itself, one of the two rooms, you'll see that the exterior of the cabin actually still has in the round logs. So these are all lodgepole, and the walls were actually mud chinked. So you can see the chinking is still in place. So just remember, this is from 1916. This cabin is holding in largely because of the quality of the workmanship. As we enter the cabin, one, the cabin's filled up a little bit with debris and the roof has collapsed. But I want you to look at the actual walls itself. While the outside is in the round, the inside has been what we call faced. And so you can see the interior of the cabin has been taken with a broad axe, handheld, while this was still on the ground, and carved. And you can still see the indentation and the cuts from those broad axes as these swedes and fins shaped this cabin to have a nice flat interior wall. So these would have been really nice. Probably even would have had wallpaper and sometimes even just Swedish language newspapers pasted in here to make it even more homey. Horsepower or animal power was a critical piece of the tie cutting experience. Not only did you need horses to bring in freight and supplies from largely the communities in Wyoming, such as Mountain View or Evanston, but you also had to use draft horses to help pull the sleds on the deep snow loaded with those railroad ties. The Black's Fork Commissary has this building I'm standing in, which is the barn. And we know it's the barn because it still has the elements that tell you that. And so I'm standing right at the mouth of a horse stall, and you can see on the right is one side of the stall, but in the back, there's actually a really cool feature that's still in place, a feed trough. So this is where they would put the hay for the horses during the winter so they could eat there. And so both sides of this giant cabin would have had horse stalls to keep the horses healthy. This is a brutal environment for human and beast, and so keeping them out of the winter weather as much as possible was really critically important, and so the tie cutters built some big structures to house them. One of the coolest things about ghost towns is being able to explore in the footsteps of those who used to live here. And as an archaeologist, I can't go anywhere without stopping. Whether my wife likes me to or not, I have to explore a ghost town when I see it. But as an archaeologist, I visit with respect, and that's what everybody should do. And so in this cabin, it's a very small cabin, we have three types of bad behavior. The first are at my feet. These are what we call classic metal detector holes. So somebody came through here using a metal detector, and this is private or federal land. It's illegal. On federal land, you can't do it at all. On private land, you need the landowner's permission. So one, it's illegal. Two, you're damaging the history because we don't have a lot of information on the people who lived in this community other than generalizations. So every time you remove an artifact, we lose a piece of that story. A second thing we say way too often, fire. So somebody stayed in here and built a little campfire long after this cabin had been abandoned. Thankfully, the fire didn't get out of hand and burn this to the ground, but it is a very common hazard for some of these old log cabins of somebody getting out of bad weather, building a campfire inside. Bad for wood. And then the last bad behavior is leaving your mark. Many of these old cabins from the early 20th century, we can still see the original inscriptions of these tie cutters who were up here in the winters alone, leaving messages that we can read today. But now visitors are scratching their own names and initials. Was there somebody else here in the 19 teens leaving their mark that had now been erased? Every time we leave a mark like this, it's irreplaceable. We can't fix the cabin back to what it looked like. So when you visit a place, don't dig, don't light it on fire, and don't leave your name. Like every industry, logging goes up and it goes down. So the Black Forks Commissary started around 1916, continued to service all the tie cutters in the surrounding mountains into the mid-1920s. As the tie cutters moved from the west side towards the Bear River to the east towards Henry Fork, they would log out an area about 15 square miles looking for that perfect diameter tree. As those trees became harder and harder to find, tie cutters would then move to a new stand. And so we know by the 1920s, Black Fork's commissary has started to decline. And by the 1930s, the next commissary, the Steel Creek Commissary, which is about 10 miles to our east, also declined. And then finally, with the 1930s arrival of portable sawmills and chain saws, the heyday of logging died in the Uintas, from the old school tie cutter from Finland with a big axe and horses, to now portable sawmills with people moving from Wyoming up into the mountains during the summer to log, and then heading back to town in the winters. And so this had a heyday for a decade or so, but the stories are still so important, because all the railroads that spread across the West in the 19 teens and 20s were using lodgepole pine from the Uinta Mountains here in Utah.